Good evening, everyone. We've got breaking news from the Supreme Court. Moments ago, the High Court blocked in full a decision by Texas-based U.S. District Judge Matthew Kacsmaryk on April 7 that invalidated the Food and Drug Administration's longtime approval of the abortion pill mifepristone. Conservative Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito publicly dissented from the decision. This means the Supreme Court has allowed the pill to stay on the market and remain widely available, at least for now. People can still obtain mifepristone by mail for now and use it at home and use it up to 10 weeks into a pregnancy as litigation continues into the Supreme Court. The generic version of the drug, made by a company called GenBioPro, will also continue to be available. Joining me now are Mini Timuraju, president of the NARAL Pro-Choice America, and Lisa Rubin, MSNBC legal analyst. Lisa, I want you to go through this decision with me because, and I think Ari talked about it in the previous hour, but what I read here is something that kind of reads like shade. This decision, talking about in recent cases, the court has been lambasted for staying a district court order based on the scanty review this court gives matters on its shadow docket. This opening with lots of criticism of people who've been critical of the court. Is that normal? And what do you make of it?
This is a court that isn't getting along particularly well, Joyce. So you're asking me, is this normal? It hasn't been normal up through the Trump presidency, and yet we now have 9 justices that are largely at each other's throats and defying the collegiality that has traditionally defined the Supreme Court. But you're right to say Justice Alito is indeed casting shade and criticizing folks like Justice Kagan, who have been critical of the court for mapping on its policy preferences to a number of different things through decisions that they don't explain by use of what we call the shadow docket. Those are cases that are not litigated on their merits, but come to the court on some application for emergency relief, as this did. And to me, it smacks of, I know you are, but what am I? Justice Alito has often been in the group of people willing to grant that emergency relief. And tonight, he's not, because it doesn't comport with his own policy preferences and specifically his longstanding antipathy toward abortion.
I want to read another part of this. This is Alito's dissent. The applicants claim that regulations then enforce it prohibited. And here well, let me just skip to this part. Here, the government has not dispelled legitimate doubts that it would even obey an unfavorable order in these cases, much less that it would choose to take enforcement actions to which it has strong objections. Lisa, this reads to me like him admitting we don't have an army. We don't have the ability to enforce our decisions, and we're not sure the government would even obey. I mean, that's a pretty glaring admission of weakness and a pretty churlish thing to write down in your dissent. This guy seems to be all in his feelings that the American people oppose his attempts to play mullah instead of Supreme Court justice and ban abortion.
And I hear that, Joy. You know, on one hand, he's not wrong. The FDA does have what's called enforcement discretion, just like a prosecutor has discretion not to bring every case that violates the law. However, there's no indication on this record, as you noted, that the FDA wouldn't follow a validly issued court order. And for him to insinuate that this administration and this independent FDA wouldn't follow the law is, to use your words, you know, absurdly churlish and frankly, not becoming a justice of the Supreme Court.
Well, there's been a lot of that going around. Mini Timuraju, let me get your reaction to this stay, which surprised a lot of people who just assumed the court was going to continue along its ban abortion trajectory. Your reaction?
You know, it's a temporary relief. You know, for providers, for patients across the country, for activists, for organizers, but most importantly, for the American people, for people who can get pregnant and women across the country. So we have temporary relief. Now this goes back to the Fifth Circuit, which is also, frankly, not a very hospitable place for abortion rights. It does mean, however, that we have more time, and time is really good in this scenario.
I want to read just another little piece of this. Just for those of you who don't read a lot of SCOTUS blog, normally these rulings are fairly dry. They're fairly sort of straightforward. But in this case, in his dissent, Alito is scathing. He writes that in another instance, we were criticized for ruling on a stay application while barely bothering to explain our conclusion, a disposition that was labeled as emblematic of too much of this court's shadow docket decision-making, which every day becomes more unreasoned. reasoned. The case that he's citing in which that criticism took place, he then cites Whole Woman's Health versus Jackson. I'm going to start with you, Minnie, and then ask Lisa to weigh in as well. It seems to me that this court, if nothing else, understands the political and social impact that its decisions have had in terms of the party of its seeming preference and the way that they have fared ever since. Is that how you see it?
Yes, and I think it's really hard to ignore the context in which this is all happening, right? We have a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on ethics in a few weeks. We have never-ending scandals on the front page involving this court. We have a history of leaks involving Justice Alito, ethics issues involving Justice Thomas. So it's hard to imagine that the court cannot understand that not only are there politics around reproductive freedom and rights at play here, but their image and their remarkably low approval rating by the American people who see them as illegitimate.
You know, Lisa, it's interesting because the idea of making the court more diverse was supposed to be that these people, with the collegiality with which they normally operate, and then getting to know the fact that you've got a Sonia Sotomayor, that you've got an Elena Kagan, that you've now got a Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, means they're now exposed to other points of view, and that they would somehow have a better sense of what the world outside of the Supreme Court is like. But it seems to me that Alito has done the opposite. He's become more insular. He's become more angry. He's become more enraged because somehow he believed that the decisions that he wrote, the decision he wrote in Jackson versus Whole Woman's Health, would be lauded. Did he think he was a defender of the faith and that people would be cheering in the streets? I'm not sure why they are so surprised, I guess so does the Republican Party, at how much chaos this has caused and how much anger.
Well, I think they're angry for a number of reasons, Joy. One is that they don't like being criticized, and Justice Alito has taken a lot of heat over the last year. Some folks pointed to him as the potential source of the leak in the Dobbs decision. He was also criticized for meeting with some donors to the Supreme Court Historical Society. He then gave a speech to a rousing standing ovation, to your point, to the 40th anniversary of the Federalist Society. And he's taken a lot of heat in the intervening time because of that. So I think there's a certain intransigence on his part, definitely digging in because of that. But you're right. These people seem further apart than ever before. And the politics of grievance that are infecting our country that lead Donald Trump to be the front runner right now in the Republican race for candidacy for president, the Supreme Court is not immune to that. That politics of grievance seems to be infecting all of our American institutions right now and every branch of government.
Yeah, indeed. Let me read what President Biden just said. He's just weighed in on tonight's news. He said in a statement, quote, "Today, the Supreme Court granted the Department of Justice's emergency stay application in alliance for Hippocratic Medicine versus FDA, preventing a lower court decision from going into effect that would have undermined FDA's medical judgment and put women's health at risk. As a result of the Supreme Court's stay, mifepristone remains available and approved for safe and effective use while we continue this fight in the courts. I continue to stand by FDA's evidence-based approval of mifepristone, and my administration will continue to defend FDA's independent expert authority to review, approve, and regulate a wide range of prescription drugs. The stakes could not be higher for women across America. I will continue to fight politically driven attacks on women's health. But let's be clear. The American people must continue to use their vote as their voice and elect a Congress that will pass a law restoring the protections of Roe v. Wade." That's President Biden. Lisa, he mentioned political decisions out of the courts, and I think that very few would argue that that's not what's happening. And that started with this Texas judge. And I want you to just talk a little bit about this judge, because this is an unusual case. The people who he's saying have standing are doctors who say that somewhere in the future they might have to treat a woman in an ER because at some point she took mifepristone. It's their job to treat women in the ER. I don't understand. I'm not a lawyer, but I don't see how they have standing to sue at all. But he let them do it. And his ruling, you want to talk about Alito's ruling being churlish, it read like a conservative screed. It didn't even read like anything I've ever read on SCOTUS blog. What is this guy's deal?
This guy, Joy, we know that he was raised in the conservative movement. He was raised actually in the crisis pregnancy movement. His mother was a long-term volunteer. His sister lived for some period of time in a home set up for unwed mothers who were committed to having their children and giving them up for adoption. He later served on the board of that organization. And I really think that Matt Kacsmaryk never expected to be on the bench. He was nominated in the first place because the organization of which he was the deputy general counsel, its general counsel was nominated to the bench, and he didn't survive the nominations process. And suddenly Matt Kacsmaryk was sort of thrust into being the Miss America of his own life, so to speak. And when he was there, he made some decisions that you and I would find not only problematic, but antithetical to the rule of law. He concealed from the Senate during his nominations process a number of things that he authored and or said in ways that start to look purposeful, in part because that was what happened to the guy who was nominated before him. He had not been honest about his own interviews with the same media organization to which Kacsmaryk gave a radio interview that was disclosed by CNN this week. So, I don't begrudge someone having fervent, heartfelt religious beliefs. What I have a real problem with is when a soldier of the anti-abortion movement becomes a federal judge with lifetime tenure. This guy should never have been confirmed.